people were stranded, and all of them out of line. When all the dreams had been branded, long beyond their time. When everyone had been told to follow kind with kind. That's when we knew that the seers, all of them were blind. This time they told us was different. This time we finally change. This time we learn all that we meant. This time we reach the range. But when the time came down to it, we found something strange. All this from the new order seemed permanently deranged. All things we've seen, those colors from blue to green, no changes to move ahead, all bring us right back instead to so everything is brand new now. Change has finally come. Now that we've finally seen how to reach everyone. Now that we've finally learned how, the tale that we have spun. I wonder when we'll all realize this plot's already been done. This time they told us was different. This time we finally change. This time we learn all that we meant. And this time we reach the range. But when the time came down to it, we found something strange. All this from the new order seemed permanently deranged. All things we've seen, those colors from blue to green, all changes to move ahead, all bring us right back instead to
there we go. Well, whether mellow or hype, that is the song Changes from my band's album 5 years later. And this, of course, is a very exciting return to the educational side of this channel, as we are pleased to present the third class from the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers with a host, Cat Rambo, class number 3, which is World Building Through Plotting. And I am getting ready to step back and that's very true. It is the Rambo Academy. I'm getting ready in just a moment to step back and listen with all of you as Kat provides awesome ideas and concepts for you about the subject of writing in this regard. Before we get started on that, though, I do want to remind everybody about ways to support the channel. If you haven't done so already, please consider following the channel. That is always a good thing to do. Please also check the YouTube channel. Excuse me. Easy for me to say. The YouTube channel with the exclamation point ARFTube. The Patreon, I'll talk about the Patreon in a minute. The Twitter with exclamation point ARV tweets. And if you can retweet this stream, that would be much appreciated. Exclamation point tweet. Please make sure to as well check out the Discord, exclamation point ARV cord, which is growing by leaps and bounds. We hang out there often in between streams. And on the financial side of things, you can find out more about that, by the way, at arvaneleron.com. On the financial side of things, the shop, our merchandise area, which has at the moment both D&D Infinity and Beyond Curse of Strahd stuff, but also Adventures in Middle-earth stuff, and soon we'll have some Espergenesis stuff as well. You can find that at exclamation point ARV shop. The Patreon, exclamation point ARV Treon, which is currently sitting at 333. That kits cool things for you, cool things for the channel. That is another way that you can support us, and it really does make a difference to the channel. And last but certainly not least, of course, that sub button right above the video window, currently sitting at about 44 subs. We would love to get that north of 50 as well as we continue to push the channel forward. Now, a couple of quick notes about schedule. Tonight, as I said, we have the return of the Cat Rambo Academy, the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, I believe, is when we have it scheduled. We have got the return of Espergenesis, which is going to be great. Now, we will have 3 people out of the 4 tomorrow, which will be Video Store Cowboy, which is Johnny Pittman, of course. We will have Cat Rambo again, and Carlos Hernandez tomorrow. And then next Friday, we will not have Kat because she will be at Dragon Con doing awesome things. So instead, we will have Zach Clay, who will be there, and again, Johnny Pittman and Carlos Hernandez. So we will have 3, and then 3, and then in this September, we will get everyone back together into the fold, as it were. On this Tuesday coming up, so that'll be Friday. On Saturday, we have, I believe, some Deus Ex Human Revolution, if I'm not mistaken, which is going to be awesome, and I cannot wait to see how that all gets played out, because I've really been enjoying that game a lot. And then next Tuesday, we have got the Gamebook illustration stream with Terry Tunes, with a Sherlock Holmes gamebook that we've been playing through, and then Pathfinder Kingmaker over on GOG and Pen and Pixels. So it's going to be exciting, and I am very happy about that. And welcome, Marguerite Noir. I'm glad that you joined for this class. That is very, very exciting. So let me explain just one quick thing before we get started here. Actually, no, before I do that, I'll do that once I actually introduce the teacher who will be providing this incredible education to all of us. So I will unmute myself so that she knows we're ready to go, and then I will unmute her, and then I will transition over. There we go. The person who really matters is the person in the large window. I am insignificant and will vanish properly. But that, of course, is Cat Rambo, star of the Espergenesis campaign here, and also, does just a little bit of a soupçon of writing, one might say, on occasion. I am joking, does a tremendous amount of writing and is extremely gifted and award-winning and has new series coming out from Tor, and just has a lot going on. And we are very, very happy to have Cat Rambo with us. Cat, welcome again for class number 3 of the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers. We are back, and is there anything you want to mention just before I talk about sub-only mode and then shut up and let you get started? Anything you want to say about stuff?
Well, I presume you'll let me shill for some live classes at the end.
Absolutely, yeah.
Probably better for it. I will tell everybody here that I finished the first draft of Exiles of Tibet today. I'm fine. It's messy and it's incoherent, but it is somewhat complete.
Nice.
So I'm really happy with that. And so now I'll put it away for a month and then come back to it and begin making it make sense. So hooray!
Awesome. That's cool. Yeah, I'm very excited to take a look at that. I actually, while I was waiting at the DMV today for an ungodly amount of time, had a chance to read work from another friend of mine, Amal Elmatar's and Max Gladstone's This Is How You Lose the Time War, and boy, is that good. I had a feeling that it was going to be pretty good from what everyone had said, but it reminded me a little bit of what you have talked about quite a bit in terms of character creation and so forth in the first couple of sessions of classes here. And I am excited to see whether some of the stuff that you talk about tonight ties into some of the things that I noticed as I was reading that book. But I bring it up just because it's just an example of how the stuff you've been teaching absolutely applies to a lot of the work that's being done right now, folks, in the industry, and not least of all, of course, in Cat's own writing. So one thing I want to mention just to everybody about the way this is going to work. Now, for the first 2 months that we did this, we allowed everyone to both watch and and ask questions and do all that stuff freely. But as everybody knows, it is important to me to try to make this something that we can monetize, especially because normally Kat, charges for this because what she's doing is teaching, and she deserves to be paid for the work that she puts into all of this. So she has been very kind to, provide this on a freer basis, but it was always part of the plan that we were going to start moving things towards a little bit more monetized model. Now, I am never going to set this up on the channel where you are not allowed to watch it. It's just not the way that I want to do things, and I think Kat's in agreement with me on that. However, we do want to be able to provide some bonus and incentive to people who subscribe to the channel. And so the way this is going to work is I am in just a moment going to put the chat into subscriber only mode. All that means is that you won't be able to ask questions or chat while sub mode is on. You'll still be able to watch it as normal. You'll still be able to do all of that kind of stuff. And at the end, I will be happy to turn subscriber mode off so that you can ask a couple of general questions about, hey, where do I sign up for your class? Or that's the greatest thing I've ever seen. Can you provide more experiences like this that are the greatest experiences I've ever had online? That sort of thing. And we'll allow for that at the end. But during the time of this going on, I'm going to allow, I want subscriber mode to be on again, just as a little bit of an extra incentive for people to be able to support the channel. In case you're wondering, how do I support the channel and become such a subscriber? You can do so for $4.99 a month. And theoretically, I guess, you could even subscribe and then let it lapse after this $5. But you're about to get an hour and a half plus of education, which frankly, at what does it work out to? $2.50 a pop is pretty damn cheap, I would say. And it is important, I think, not just for Kat and myself, but also for other people who are trying to be paid for work that they have, are presenting to other people, that we do something of this kind. So I hope people will understand that we're doing that. It is not to shut everybody out. It is more to encourage people to come in. And so you can do that by clicking on that sub button right above that video window. And so with that said, Selkos, before subscriber mode goes on, many hearts. I love it. I love it. That's awesome. Thank you for understanding, everybody. And for those of you who are already subscribed and or mods like JRab, for example, who's here, Nordwolf, who's subbed, if as people come in, they're like, someone like DMs you like, why can't I talk? What's going on? If you could explain, and I will try to periodically mention it to them, why we're doing it this way and sort of explain the deal, they will understand. It's rare to use sub mode, but I think it's important for this. And since this is the first time we're doing it, that's why it took a little bit of a longer time. Now, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to put this into sub mode, and I'm going to hand things over to the incredibly talented Kat Rambo to explain what will happen with the class. So, Kat, the floor is yours.
Of course, immediately I need to cough. So to add to what Greg said, for Patreon people, I have a post up, and which is basically, it's the same one where you've got this link. So if you want to put questions up in there, I do have that open and am trying to remember to look at it periodically, although I think it auto pops if you post something. So a few things. Welcome. Thank you for spending part of your Thursday evening or afternoon or morning or whatever it is for you with me. This is the third time I've done the class. The first time that we did it, we talked about sort of world building through world building, or focusing on what were the ways that you created the world in writing. And then in the second class, we took the approach of sort of character, or world building through character, and talking about characters and how to have your characters relate to the world and how to sort of have them be part of the world. And so when we're talking about stories, there really is a sort of holy triumvirate, which is world or setting, and then character. And our third part is what we want to talk about tonight, which is plot, story and plot. And it's the thing that I want to focus on, because we're doing a short class, we're kind of drilling down on a specific point, is talk about world building through plotting, or how to create your world through the things that you do in it, through the things that you have your characters do, through the things that you have them move around. Sorry, I'm making sure that my Patreon post is not And so I want to distinguish, or I want to set up some basics before I start. And they are sort of the ideas of story and plot and plotting, which I'm going to say is something different than plot, although it is related. So plot is what happens, right? Plot is X does X, and this leads to Y, and then Z happens because of all of that. That's a plot. While story is the manner in which you relate that plot. You might start at the beginning or start at the middle, or you might start at the end and tell it backwards. The movie Memento is an example of telling the story backwards. Related to that is the idea of plotting. And that is you as a writer figuring out what happens, when it happens, in what order it's told in. So a combination of plot and story go into the actual plotting. So whenever I write up these classes, I try to focus on threes, because that is one of the magic rules, is that if you have things in threes, like the three billy goats gruff, or the three little pigs and that sort of thing, for some reason it works better for folks. So I want to talk about, first off, kind of one of fantasy and science fiction strengths, the idea of the spectacular, and kind of and how putting your character in spectacular settings can help you world build. And then I want to talk about kind of using your world to generate problems for your character. And then finally, I want to talk about using the economics of your world to shape plot and vice versa. Okay. So, one of the things that we really want to stress about all of this is that the world has to be more than just wallpaper. It has to be something that shapes the plot. It has to be something that adds to the plot, that embellishes it, that enhances it, but just that overall affects the plot. So just as we said last time with characters, your character should affect the story. Your character, it should be their story. It should be a story that could not be told without them in that spot. Similarly, the world should affect the story. It should be hopefully a story that has to be told in that world. Now, is that totally necessary? No. And one of those reasons is that we have a sort of the default real world in which everything by nature gets placed. But let's talk about this idea of the spectacular. And this is one of the things that is fantasy and science fiction's great strengths. This is where we engage in what people are talking about when they mention the phrase eyeball kicks, when they're talking about things that really make somebody go, wow, that is fabulous. I really love that. An example of a sort of spoken one of this that I love is that moment in Blade Runner where Roy Batty is dying in the rain, and he's like, can you think of the things that I've seen, Decker? And he kind of launches into this list of beautiful details. We love, as readers, these enormous, beautiful, or sometimes hideous, but always wonderful landscapes that fantasy and science fiction create for us. And if you doubt that, think about one of the things that was focused on again and again in Game of Thrones, which was the wall, right? And you always got that sense of the wall and how huge it was. And there were these teeny tiny medieval elevators going up and down. And it was a fabulous construction. So you want to create places, you want to create stories where they get played out in places like this. But it doesn't have to always be sort of starships off the shoulder of Aldebaran or whatever. It can just be sort of through beautiful language. I have several examples. I'm going to do them in order. So I was looking at, this is from a great book called The New Space Opera, which is edited by Gardner Dozois. Just want to hear it. This is from Bert Handy's Ring by Ian MacDonald. And what I'm going to do is read the first 3 paragraphs, which are fairly lengthy, and then I want to talk a little bit about what Ian MacDonald is setting up in them and how they fit into this idea. Okay. After 13 subjective minutes and 528 years, the clade battleship, ever fragrant perfume of divinity, returned to the dying solar system. The Oot-Urt cloud web pulled the crew off, skating around the gravity wells of hot, fat gas giants in the swelling primary. The battleship skipped out of the system at 30% life speed into the deep dark. Small, fast, cheap, the battleships were disposable. A football of construction nanoprocessors and a payload crew of 3 embedded in the heart of a comet. A comet it would slowly consume over its half millennium of flight. So cheap and nasty was this ship that it was only given a name because the crew got bored 5 subjective minutes into the slow time simulation of the so-friendly desert monasticism that was a preferred combat interface. The Oort cloud web caught the crew, shied them to the construction yard, skeiing through the long cold loops of the cometary halo, which flicked them in a stutter of light speed to the fat gas giant relay point, where the 800 habitats of the new clade daughter fleet formed a pearl belly chain around the planet. Then to the clade heart world herself, basking in the coronal energies of the senile, grasping, swollen sun, and finally into fresh new selves. Hi guys, we're back, said the crew of ever-fragrant perfume, as they stepped from the bronze gates of the soul house down the marble staircase into the thronged maiden of all luminous passion. Irony was still a tradable commodity on this innermost tier of the 100 concentric spheres of the heart world, even if not one man or woman or machine or beastly turned its head. Battleship crews knew better than expect laurels and accolades when they resold after 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years on the front line. Word of ever-fragrant perfume's victory had arrived almost 3 centuries before. A signal victory, a triumph that would be studied and taught across the military colleges and academies of the art of defense for millennia to come. A classic Rose of Jericho strategy. Okay, so you get this sense of just such a rich, deep world, and it's because he's showing stuff in action. He's not kind of like, and there is an academy, and it does this. He's like, oh, here's something that would get taught in the academy. It's just sort of, it's a throw off detail. And you get all these little things seeded into the text that can get seized on later on in the course of the story. And the cool thing about that, and one of the things that I suggest you want to do when you are writing, and particularly if you're a pantser, this is that you're sitting down and writing your first few pages, go and look to see what your unconscious mind has seeded into those first few paragraphs or pages, because you're probably going to lop off a page or two, depending if you're a pantser. It usually takes a little while to get going. But is there stuff that you can expand upon? With the academy, can you have somebody who teaches at the academy? Can you have somebody who's a student at the academy? Can you have 2 rival professors of the academy? Can you have someone who's a graduate? Can you have someone who's trying to take something to them? It's just like all sorts of possibilities. Every time you have a very careful named detail like that. Notice that you see technology in action when the crew is getting back ensouled, right? And there isn't a long chunk of description where it's like, this is how this technology works, blah, blah, blah. It's here, the crew has just been ensouled. The crew, and you know from context sort of enough about it. You know that basically they have been put into, you presume, new bodies, new forms. And that is not something that then gets, thrown into the story and then never used again. That becomes part of the story. That becomes something that is important to the story. Whenever your first few paragraphs involves technology like that, think about what sort of problems it might create. Okay. So you want to, I would suggest, put something, usually, right, in any rule of thumb is just that it's a rule that you use sometimes if you kind of need a rule to apply, and if you don't need it, you don't need it. But putting a sense of your world in the first 3 paragraphs is super important, and putting something that it matters about the world in the first 3 paragraphs is super important. So let's look at another. I'll give you just, I think it's the first paragraph. Oops. This is from the first of the Gormenghast novels by Mervyn Peake, which are just fabulous and have a first paragraph that just makes, it's one of those first paragraphs that makes me despair when I read it because it's just so beautiful. So this is the book. I'm curious about it. Gormenghast, that is the main massing of the original stone, taken by itself would have displayed a certain ponderous architectural quality, were it possible to have ignored the circumfusion of those mean dwellings that swarmed like an epidemic around its outer walls. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbor, until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels laid hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like limpets to a rock. These dwellings, by ancient law, were granted this chill intimacy with the stronghold that loomed above them. Over their irregular roofs would fall throughout the seasons the shadows of time-eaten buttresses, of broken and lofty turrets, and most enormous of all, the shadow of the Tower of Flint. This tower, patched unevenly with black ivy, arose like a mutilated finger from among the fists of knuckled masonry and pointed blasphemously at heaven. At night, the owls made of it an echoing throat. By day, it stood voiceless and cast its long shadow. Okay, that is one of my favorite first paragraphs of all time. I think it is just freaking brilliant. And besides the fact, I mean, and I actually use that in my story writing class when I teach it. And the details of it are important, right? The Tower of Flint, sorry, this just fell out of my keywords. So the Tower of Flint is something that is central to the plot. It doesn't just sort of loom over things in this paragraph. It looms over the whole plot of the novel. It looms over what's happening. Those mean dwellings that are clinging to the castle are not just there for decorative purpose. They are going to furnish some of the protagonists of the story. And they are going to, and notice that the way that they're described tells you something about them. Yeah, Gormenghast is a really, if you're interested in description, I think this is a brilliant book. It's a very slow book. If you don't like slow books, this is not for you. All right. So how do you create that sort of scope and that sort of engagement? Throw books on the floor. We've talked before about how important sensory stuff is. And I'm not saying that tell us how the stuff smells, although that's good. I'm saying that you can also invoke it when you are describing it in through colors and through verbs and through details like that. You want to, I think, often with these landscapes to show some of the small particular details, the rivets on the surface of the closest spaceship, so we can appreciate how real it is. And then that can help us fill in all those other spaceships that are sort of sketched out further on down the row. Look for description that is concrete rather than abstract. And by abstract, what I mean, don't tell us it was beautiful. Don't say it was pretty or magnificent or awesome or really pretty goddamn nifty or something like that. Give us details that make us think beautiful or awesome or nifty. Give us language that says, I want you to think awesome, or I want you to think beautiful. I want you to think nifty. And finally, show the viewer in relationship to it. Show people where they are, I think, is often really useful. This is one of the things I see people go awry often, is not giving us a point of reference, not giving us a place to set our feet as we look at whatever it is. And I would argue that Ian MacDonald one that I just read you does, that you see plenty of details that when they emerge from the hall, whose name I have forgotten. Okay. Wow, time. Oh, it's because we started late. That's why. So time is going by super fast. You want to, I think, you want to put things when you can in interesting settings. You know, if you're going to have your two spies meet, and you notice this in movies, they don't meet in a laundromat usually. They meet someplace with more kind of nifty stuff that can get blown up. Yeah, maybe they'll meet in a laundromat. I actually think that'd be a good place for spies to meet. But most of the time, you want to make the most of the visual highlights around you. And this is particularly true, I think, when you're creating a world that you really want the reader to love, or the reader to feel like they're part of. And I'm thinking of Anne McCaffrey's dragon books and the fire lizards, and how often we saw like little spirals of fire lizards playing on the beach. Yeah, there could be laundromats that'd be fascinating. They could be shooting sparks or stars. But I mean, generally, why not put it someplace interesting if you can, and then have it someplace interesting that's going to affect things. One of my favorite tropes is the sort of the kung fu fight that takes place in the kitchen of a restaurant. And so there's all sorts of cutlery and forks and, pots of pasta and all sorts of stuff like that. And I think that's a really fun trope to play with. And of course, that cannot happen unless you put it in a large restaurant kitchen, which I will argue is an interesting setting. Living rooms are usually not particularly interesting. Living rooms are not dynamic storylines. I would remember, when you are creating your fabulous, spectacular landscapes, remember that flora and fauna and fish and all sorts of other living stuff, or even temporary stuff like weather conditions, can be spectacular, right? You could have a planet full of luminous, beautiful fog. You could have one where the lightning storms are playing over things. The book that I just finished for Tor, there's a point where they're looking down into a chasm, and there's just these sort of roiling blue depths, and I've sort of hand-wavy them how they were created, but mainly I wanted that visual effect of these sort of electric blue worms of light crawling in the abyss. Okay, So let me check and make sure there's no Patreon questions. Okay, and none over here. So I'm going to move along and talk about um, plotting through what's happening in your landscape. I'm actually going to use another passage. This is from a book that I just started. I'm not that far into it, but I think it's really smart. It's by John Kessel, called The Moon and the Other. And it is set in an interesting space. Okay, and I'm going to skip around as I read it, but think about kind of like what is getting told us about the plot as we go here. His body lay elsewhere, strapped to a frame in a control cubicle, but he perceived himself to be deep in the cold of Faustini crater, linked to a remote operating device that gave him the strength and reach of a giant. There, in perpetual night, he loaded carriers with heaps of billion-year-old ice. There he cut and scooped and carried, under the glare of the lights, in service of Persepolis Water and Cyrus Iskander, the Shah of Ice. Skip. He watched the other RODs spread across the floor of the crater. The flare of a plasma cutter dazzled his plugged eyes. When the ice-laden regolith calved an avalanche, tremors made him shift on his plugged-in legs. If he looked up and adjusted the gain on his eyes, he could see a brilliant star-strewn sky. He didn't look up very often. Skip another beat. Erno knew something of indigence and poor judgment. The back of his head still throbbed from last night's brawl, and he had trouble focusing. They were working a notch in the depths of the basin. The RODs operated by Tahir Neely and Devi Singh were down the line from him. The cart that followed Erno was almost full, shy only a few hundred kilos of capacity. Here the percentage of frozen water was the highest in the basin, blocks and sheets at depth, which is why they'd followed this notch so far. Dark walls towered over them, a canyon where the only light came from the blue arcs and cutters. When he touched the beam of his cutter to the rock and ice, steam rose immediately, dark blue glints among the powder and stone. He had to widen the beam to a millimeter so the vapor would not refreeze as soon as he cut it. The external temperatures here were among the coldest in the solar system, as low as 40 degrees Kelvin. If you weren't careful, you could create a pocket of vapor and cause an explosion. Machines regularly malfunctioned in such cold. Metal crumbled, ceramics became conductors, and even the most hardened processors were prone to soft upsets. Some stray cosmic ray sets off a circuit in a CPU, and there you are with a flaring jet, a dead communicator. In the days when people, instead of RODs, did this work, the fatality rate among ice miners was the highest on the moon. Okay, so much about the world goes into that, but notice how much of it is about problems and dangers. And the fact that this is an environment where it is always unrelentingly hostile to people if they cannot afford to be careless. It also tells you, again, technology, that he's operating this ROD, this remote operated droid, I think is what that stands for. And of course, is that going to be accidental and we never hear about the RODs again? No. It's going to be important. His experience is going to be important, and he's going to be our main character, probably. Well, actually, I know that because we've been a few chapters in. I used that particular passage because I think it sort of moves us from this idea of scope to looking at what are the dangers of that scope. So think about what are the dangers of your world? What are the things that complicate your character's life about the surroundings? Is it a place where there are poisonous snakes all over the place? Okay, that's going to affect what your character does, and it's going to affect how people live, and it's going to affect the degree of technology they devoted to antivenoms. Right? All of that is going to be important. Think about what temptations your world provides. What are the places where someone could do something dangerous in search of a temptation? If your character wants money, sometimes he or she or they or whatever may go to great lengths to get it. What are the places where you can really put their resolve to the test? What do people do for thrills? Because thrills are usually dangerous. So what are the death sports in your world? And maybe if there's none, that's important. And one of the things about thrills is often there's sort of that is a thing of the rich, right? It is something that people do because they have time and money and free time, basically, and resources. So what are the things that the rich do in your world? What are the cheap versions that people do? I think that this is one of the places where you can make your world very fresh and more unexpected if you are willing to kind of invert things. If in fact it turns out that those poisonous snakes are necessary because they are the things that activate people's telepathic powers when they bite them. Or perhaps, I don't know, I'm thinking of various things with snake bites, and I don't like snake bites, so they all seem horrible. You could come up with various ways to make snake bites benign. Perhaps your magical powers depend on how many snakes you have been bitten by. Well, I mean, think about actually Vonda McIntyre's Dream Snake. Where it is a character in a post-apocalyptic landscape, and that's how she administers medicine, is through the snakes that she carries. It gets them to bite people. Great book. Totally recommend that. Vonda McIntyre. All right. So I'm still not seeing questions, so I'm going to move on and talk about this idea of world building and thinking about the economics of sort of how plotting and economics relates, I guess, is what I want to say. And I think that your world is built to a certain degree by supply and demand. I mean, like basically societies are a mixture of biological urges and scarcity and plenitude. And so you want to think what's plentiful, what's scarce, what problems does that create for your character? How can you use that scarcity to create problems for your character? And here, like one of the things that you can do whenever you want to make a character's life more complicated, and I would suggest that you do want to continue, like when in doubt, I don't know what to do with the story, make a character's life more complicated. Do something that makes things tougher for them. Removing resources is a really good way to complicate their existence. Putting restrictions on new ones, right? You can give them new resources, but make things complicated in terms of how they can use them or not. You want to think, you want to be like, particularly when you're working on fantastic worlds, and of course, I don't know that this applies if you're doing sort of fantasy set in this world, unless you've got a society that you're building into it. If you're writing secondary world fantasy, though, if you're writing science fiction, you want to be an anthropologist. You want to think in terms of your culture, and you want to think in terms of what stories does your culture tell to account for that scarcity and demand, or supply and demand, that scarcity and plenitude. One of the best ways to make a world feel super cartoonish is to have the economics of it be not valid in a sort of very fundamental way. And that can be okay, right? We can have cartoonish worlds, or you can have worlds where this sort of stuff gets disregarded. But be aware that this is something that readers think about. If you can show the reader that you've thought about these things, and by that I don't mean that you have to supply a complete thesis on how the free market system works in your dwarvish kingdom. I just mean that you need to know that the dwarves probably have a lot of metal, probably have a lot of gems, and that if their country doesn't have wheat fields, for example, they're probably going to be trading some of that for wheat, right? So you're probably not going to have many dwarvish bakers. You have many more dwarvish miners than bakers. So maybe you subvert that. Now I want to do a dwarvish baker. Questions about any of this? Kind of, I think that you want to, with stories, right? You know, the basic thing about stories is that your character has a problem and they try to solve it, and their life gets harder and things get more tense until it gets to the point where they solve it, and then the tension in the story drops away. So you've got this sort of, you know, building tension, and then it drops away. And that is the 99% of the stories, that is the structure that it takes. And when you hear people talk about the try, fail, try, succeed structure, that's it, right? Try, fail, try, succeed. Boom, you're done. You can use your knowledge of story structure to help you when you are lost in plotting. You're trying to figure out what happens next in the story. You've tried just sitting down and writing your way in, and basically your character just sat there in the coffee shop and smoked a lot of cigarettes. Well, use this sort of thing to get them galvanized into action, right? Complicate their life. Your character is in the coffee shop. Suddenly they realize they don't have their wallet. They have bought 5 frothy extra shot cappuccinos and they owe $40 to that barista. Now, what are they going to do, right? When in doubt, make your character's life more complicated. Do it through something that is in the story already. Do it from something that is provided by the world, or that is provided by the character. Is it provided by, something at hand? Don't have, this is why we don't have stories where like suddenly comets smash through roofs and change people's lives, unless early on in the story we have established that that is a valid story mechanism, right, in some way. Other questions, comments? We're at the kind of the part of the class where I'm happy to talk about questions. Oh, Jim Butcher does a great job about screwing with the characters, and he's like, one of the reasons that I love Harry Dresden is he's got this constant low-level thing which is constantly complicating his life, which is the fact that he breaks machines, and he has to be careful about that. And so, it's so well thought out and it affects him on several different levels. And so like, he even has the crappy car that he drives because it's later model cars just poop out on him. So yeah, I think he does a really good job of screwing with the characters. Yeah. And that's one of the things that you want to think about. I think if you really want to make a world feel complete, is spend some time daydreaming about it and thinking about the implications of it. If you have a fantasy world, sometimes it's fun if there is something, you're doing something in the real world that correlates, like you're going to the grocery store and you want to think about the grocery stores in your fantasy world, walk down the aisle and think about how would they be different? How would they translate it? What would be the same? Because that's fun. I mean, think about the Terry Pratchett books, right? The Discworld stuff. A lot of that is our world kind of run through the wacky Terry Pratchett Discworld filter. And so you've got he does interesting stuff like with that. And think about the golems and the fact that they want to be freed. He actually asks some interesting questions. They're not just fluffy, even though it's very funny stuff. All right. So I'm at the chatty point. Arv, do you want to? I'm sorry. This is my wrap up on world building through plotting. And the thing that I want to say is, this can be a source of inspiration for you, right? If you have a world and you're not sure what the story that you want to create in it is, think about what problems arise simply because of the way that world is. You know, who are the people that are most put at disadvantage by that? And if you want to kind of build the world outward, you know, think about your plot and think about, like, what sort of world does that take place in? What kind of world would make it harder? What would make it more complicated? I'm working on a caper piece. You know, like, and by caper, I mean like Ocean's 11, you know, like it's a bunch of ensemble doing a scam. And I'm doing it in a sort of near future virtual space. And one of the fun things about it has been sort of like, you know, riding on the bus and staring out the window and thinking about what would the virtual world be like? And one of the things that I was thinking about was that probably there would be high competition for cycles, computer cycles. And so, in fact, if you had somebody who sort of retired into virtual life, they might sort of hoard their cycles. So it's one of the things.
I was, that's really, really fascinating stuff. And I was thinking a little bit as you were talking about, first of all, Ian McDonald would have been, you mentioned the thing about despairing when you read it. That's kind of how I feel whenever I read one of Ian's things, because I'm just kind of like, how is it possible that it sounds like he's a native of every place that he writes about? It's amazing really to me. And the opening of the Dervish House is the most amazing, one of the most amazing openings I've ever read. But I was also going to mention City in the City. Yeah, for sure. I was going to mention City in the City as an example of a place that, or a book, I guess I should say, that asks questions, where the world has a profound effect on the character's development. And everything about that world, I think, integrates or interacts interestingly with the characters, in that the world itself is constructed by the willing choice of the characters to see it or not, which I find an extraordinarily powerful metaphor for what people go through in cities all the time. You know, there's the New York City that the tourists see at Times Square, and there's the city that people know of in the subways that they consciously unsee if they're just trying to get home from work or whatever. Rats, homeless, and other things that are beautiful, actually. You know, musicians, just different things like that. So anyway, it reminded me a little bit as you were talking about the nature of how characters create these aspects of the world through perception. Right. And I would, that's I think a world that has a certain, it's got that beautiful, I'm thinking of that moment where there's a moment where he's on the train, and for people who are not familiar with the books, basically the premise is that there are two cities side by side, and that they're sort of, they interlock, but the citizens of one city do not perceive the citizens of the other city, or actually it is illegal for them to interact. But there's a scene when he's on the subway and he looks up, as you do when you're on the subway, he's looking out the window and makes eye contact with someone from the other city. And it's just like this fabulous, fabulous moment. And it's very cinematic. And I think one of the things that may be helpful for people, particularly people who think in sort of cinematic imagery, and people who like to think in, you know, like graphic novel terms, is those moments can be done in text.
and they can be made beautiful. And that is, I think, one of the great joys of fiction.
Yeah, and on the subject of graphic novels, by the way, and then I want to throw it open to, see if we can get a few more people with subs or everything else chatting. And then, as I said, for those of you who are not subs, you will have a chance at the very end to chat a little bit with Kat, not too much because we want to, again, we're trying to provide a little bit of an extra incentive for people to be able to subscribe, and or if you are part of Kat's Patreon, you can ask questions as well. But everyone's getting the chance to watch this, so I hope that is, you're enjoying it, I hope, as much as I am. But on the subject of the graphic novel, the having a chance to work with this very intensely now over the last couple of years, working on my own graphic novel stuff, it is really a striking experience. If you get a chance to script a graphic novel, if you get a chance to read a few, you can gain some real powerful perspective in going back and forth, by which I mean Icarus started as a novel, which was then transformed into a graphic novel. And it's, as I've talked about on panels, a very humbling experience to watch, your carefully crafted 1,000+ word, the old thing about a picture's worth 1,000 words, at least, to be able to see that rendered beautifully. And the thing that Neil Gaiman said, and I want to make sure I get this right, and I'm curious about your thoughts about this, Kat. He said that the reason the graphic novel form is so fascinating is that it's the only place that you can see the process of time all at once. So being able to see the evolution of something, right, on a page at once, you can take it in all at once in a way that we cannot do, even at our best, even if we sort of, try to provide things and just focus on what Kat was talking about tonight, focus on just the concrete details, or focus on those small details at times and really kind of allow them to be dynamic and all the things. Even with that, we still have to process it in a linear way, which is not the case if you are looking at just a spread, right, in a graphic novel. That page, that overwhelming sense of just, wow, is something which prose can't necessarily replicate. And I wonder if there's something that we can learn from that about trying to, as much as we can, capture aspects of that within our fiction. And there's, by the way, there are strengths that we can have that graphic novels will not get in terms of interior life and other aspects of things that don't get rendered in graphic novels as easily. But that has got to be one of its strengths. So I'm curious about what you think about what we could learn from the visual in world building specifically, do you think?
Well, first off, I'm going to say I can't chat because I'm not a subscriber.
Whoops.
But,
right. Let me. Okay, I'll pull it off of sub mode.
Kombucha. It is Brew Doctor Kombucha Happiness flavor, which is white tea and rose. You can't really taste the rose.
Unexamined,
all right.
Unintended consequences.
No, I think it's really interesting that you asked that. And one of my favorite books is Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which I think it has a great deal to say to a fiction writer on a number of different levels, including what he says about characters and how the reader identifies with the character, and the fact that sort of the plainer drawn the character, the easier it is for the reader to identify with them. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I, like, you want to think about it in terms of pacing and in rhythm. Think about a 9-panel page where it's like boom, 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 and everything has sort of the exact same size and the same weight. You could do that textually. You could do that, you could have little passages that, like flashes of a scene. You could jump from one viewpoint to another. And I think that often that can be something that can be a source of inspiration for a writer, is to look at something that they really, really enjoyed in a graphic novel and say, or television or movie or whatever,
right,
and say, how do I replicate that? How do I make it, how do I do that in text? What's the challenge? And I think, writers, if you want to be a good writer, you should always be challenging yourself. You should always be trying to kind of learn new techniques and learn new things. And I think you should be falling flat on your face every once in a while, because, give yourself permission to fail terribly, because, people don't have to see it.
In fact, a lot of great works of literature have been essentially, massive failures that are successful in a way because of how they fail. I used to ask my father about the difference between Jane Austen and Herman Melville, because he had great admiration for both, and they were very different. And he was like, well, Austen had these perfectly formed pieces of scrimshaw, right? Like all of her books are exquisitely well crafted. And Melville is sloppy and has sections. If you tried to put stuff before editors today, you have a whole chapter talking about the symbolism of the major aspects of your book. Like, you would get hammered by editors these days.
Well,
like just these broad-based, and yet part of what makes that sort of book work is the fact that it seems as if it's going for an enormous amount. And so when we get to Ahab at the end and he's shouting at the storm, just like, Lear and Shakespeare, that we have this sense that there's an overflow of his emotion into the world around him, right? And so that, in a way, Melville, that really, a lot of the book does not hang together, but it's precisely the ways that it doesn't hang together that make you go, man, look at what he's going for, in this. So
one of my favorite pieces of nonfiction writing is Mark Twain talking about James Fenimore Cooper.
Yep.
He just hated Cooper's writing, and he goes through it. By the time you're reading it, you're like, wow, Cooper was pretty bad.
Yep.
But at the same time, Cooper was kind of one of the genre writers of his time, and that he was doing these lurid, racist fantasies. But yeah, it's. I don't even know how we remember how we got here, Craig.
Oh, well, we were talking a little bit, I think, about. We were just talking a little bit about, being not afraid to fail, basically, in the way that you construct the world, and how that's an example of it. And there's, there, for whatever else that book is, it does construct beautifully the world of being on a whaling ship. In often brutal detail.
And I will argue that some of the books that really do well are the ones that are not afraid to color outside the lines.
Right.
And I'll point to Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice, where in what it does with pronouns, and people may not, basically what it does is the default pronoun is she, which instead of he, which is it's an interesting maneuver, and something that Anne got a lot of pushback from the editor about, and was like, hey, you need to change this. And Anne was like, no. And I love Anne. I could just see her be like, yeah, I don't think so.
I was going to say, I can't imagine. I should be like, what?
No, nope. And that is one of the things that really stands out about that book. And I think a lot of times when the books, Gormenghast, I would argue, stands the test of time, in that periodically it's going to be rediscovered by scholars, and they're going to go, holy fuck, what is this? But it is the weirdest, wackiest book that Mervyn Peake kind of wrote, the book that his heart led him to write.
Yep.
It's so good, though.
Yep. And that was a very good example. There are books like that are sort of almost breathtaking in how they go about the way that they I mean, the example that comes to mind for me, which is the big classic, is James Joyce and Ulysses, who just breaks the rule constantly, all the way around. Like every chapter is a new form, is a new, is experimenting. I mean, it's almost breathtaking in how broadly, it goes about things.
And yet drawing on Ulysses, the Ulysses myth.
Yep.
So taking
this Dublin, giving you a map of Dublin, essentially. I mean, you can even do the walkabout, right? You can do, not the walkabout, you can do the Bloomsbury Walk, right? Where you can walk around and literally follow his tracks. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
That is my only regret. Everybody went off to Worldcon in Dublin this year, and I did not go. And I really would have liked to go. And I've been to Dublin once and loved it, but going to see Joyce's Tower is one of the things I would like to see.
I couldn't swing it financially, but and do you know I would have been on a panel of D&D with Scott Lynch. I was like, God bless America. Oh well. So this is a chance to ask a few questions. If anyone's got any questions that remain, also hi Coven. Sub mode is now off, so other people could ask a couple of questions towards the end here. For those of you who were watching, if you were subs, you could ask questions or comments during the class if you want. Although my experience in the first few of these is that everyone has been basically kind of enraptured. So then we're like, is everything fine? They're like, yeah, we're just writing furiously, like, you know, all these things as they're going along. So, so if you have other questions, now is the time to throw them in Kat's direction.
So Regina is asking on Patreon the book about two cities. It's called The City and the City.
Yep.
And it's China, Mieville, and they are doing it's a television series now as well.
Yeah, which I haven't had a chance to see, but it seems I'd be interested to see how they handle it.
So Parsifal is asking about other on-demand classes. Yes, I am. So I have both live and on-demand ones. I have several live ones coming up this weekend. Saturday, Fran Wild is doing a class called Creativity Through Journaling, which she's given. I think this is the 4th or 5th time she's done it, and it's a lot of fun. And then on Sunday, I am doing a class that was called Replenishing the Well Springs, and it's about writing in a very confusing and discouraging time. It's the first time that I've taught that, so it will be, who knows what will happen in that. And then that afternoon on Sunday, actually, Doug Smith is teaching the first class on, it's called Playing the Short Game, and it's about how to send short stories out, how to research markets and how to find them and how to submit. And Doug, if you don't know who he is, maintains the excellent foreign market list, which is a huge resource and is a terrific writer and really knows his stuff. Regina is asking, she loves stories where the world is very similar to ours, but with a twist. Things that you would recommend specific to that kind of world building. And a good example of that that I read recently is Shannon McGuire's October Day books, where you have not just our world, but you have this parallel world with the fairies and the fae. And there, I would think about the problems that they cause for each other. Like, where are they intersecting? Where are they overlapping? What issues does that cause? Who's controlling access to that twist, right? Like, what sort of supply and demand issues does that twist create?
Right.
If you have magic, boy, if magic is, what is the price of magic? Because magic always has to come with a price.
Yeah, the idea of there always being a cost is important. I also wanted to mention, I was on a panel at NorwestCon some years ago with Robin Hobb, who was talking about religion. It was a panel about religion and magic, and that famous thing about religion can be seen as indistinguishable from magic, etc. But the thing that was interesting was, again, and I this is what started me thinking about it, and every good writer who's ever talked about this, including you, Kat, has brought up this idea, is that it creates these questions that that you then go on to answer, and which in the answering will raise other questions. And a lot of world building really is just following the breadcrumbs of those questions. What would this mean if X were true? I was interested in the idea you gave of John Kessel's Moon and the Other about, if you're working in those conditions, what does that mean? What is the impact of a society or of a group of people that are having to deal in conditions of that nature? How does that affect people? And what are the consequences of it? And how does that affect character development and so on? So anyway, that reminded me a little bit of aspects of how important questions from your world ultimately becomes important too.
Yeah, Coven Guy's mentioning the casting of spells, essentially prayer under specific ritual. Absolutely. Yeah. Those things blend together. Yeah. And, the lots of, think about D&D and paladins, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, and the effect that these things have, it's fascinating to think about religion in the world of D&D, where atheism is not really an option because the gods do exist. The question is that, those who choose not to, who shun religion, do so at a great danger to themselves because the gods do exist. And what do you do in that kind of an environment? So it's kind of interesting to see how that actually happens. All right. Any other questions that folks have for Kat? Although this is,
I will say one of the things that you brought up, I mean, there is that sort of, one of the things about pantsing is sort of discovering details through writing into whatever it is. It is a lot of fun.
Yep. No,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Oh, D&D is a great way to learn writing and creativity. Storytelling games are awesome. We just played. This has actually been a ARV heavy week, in that this Monday we played Hearts of Wulin, which is a storytelling game uh, based on Chinese wuxia. And then of course tomorrow we're playing Esper Genesis. If you want to see a good game, tomorrow Esper Genesis is just a ton of fun,
Yeah.
and Arv is a really good DM.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
well, you are.
Thank you. It's the space. Yeah, I mean, like, Parsifal, I do a talk about story building in D&D and about how, like, how those things play into each other enormously in enormously valuable ways. Um, and yeah, so 100%. And I also want to point out just very quickly that, not to be a mutual compliment society, but, Kat is a very good player. And one of the ways you can tell that is because Kat is always thinking about how her character would react to the situation she's faced, like she's facing. I was thinking about this with Hearts of Wulin. There's a section of the adventure where she has to get information from a guard. She gets information from a guard or character, and then the guard gets drunk, and she's like, "Well, I got him drunk so that he could tell me all these things about the situation." And then someone asks, "Did you get the name?" And she says, "No, but we could go find that out later." Now, certain players sort of trying to min-max this would say, "Well, of course, I got every bit of information I could ever," but it's a lot more fun and true to the character for her character, Young Turtle, to have forgotten that part because she was so pumped up about the fact that she got all this information. And that too provided within the world building, which is that she kind of made a mistake with this guard, her character is further developed and is more appealing and realistic precisely because she didn't do everything perfectly and she made a mistake. So that's an example of, I think, the Cat's writer brain, coming through a little bit in the way that gets represented. So
I love Young Turtle. Young Turtle's
she's a great
awesome.
character. I
Oh
really,
God.
I like all of those. I really am digging that, watching that campaign kind of unfold.
Well, and I think one of the things about that game is that it lets, like, the game master is always like, "Well, tell us how this failure looks, or tell us what this, like, I don't know if you
Yeah.
noticed, like last night, and he was like, "Tell us how this hallway looks as
Yeah.
we come along it."
Yeah. How does it look
It's
like when
really
they
good.
succeed or fail? It's really neat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, all right. Any
Okay.
last ones? Last ones?
Let me check my list to see if I've got any ones here.
Think he's struggling with it. Oh, well, I mean, Margarita, it's just a matter of thinking a little bit about what purpose the race is designed to serve. Like, why does a good way to look at it is when you start writing any story, why are you writing the story? What idea are you representing in the story? What visual image gave you the idea for the story? What character story do you want to tell? That's the writing version of that. And so what is it about this race that excites your cousin? Because if you can provide what excites you, that's why Kat's idea about world building today was so smart, because the fascination of the worlds that we create is one of our great strengths. And so lean into it, this is why these things create this sense of wonder. And wonder, I think, is more accessible through fantasy than almost any other genre. And so it's valuable to be able to do that. Hey, Coven, you know where I am. You could find me for sure. All right. Well, so this was wonderful, wonderful. As always, Kat, I was actually live tweeting some of it as we were going along and getting a lot of people responding with lots of likes and, ooh, that's cool. So if you folks came and you like this and you're like, wow, this is cool, there are two things you need to think about. One is going to find more of Kat's classes on demand, and I will let her describe those in just a moment. The other, of course, is to come right back here once per month, where we will be doing the class just like this. This was class number 3, but we will be doing another class in September and October because this is exactly the kind of content that I want to continue to build on my channel, and having someone of Kat's expertise to do it is a great blessing. So definitely you should follow the channel, and if you want to be able to comment while that's going on, you can sub too, or support the Patreon, both mine and Kat's or Kat's, because that's a way for you to be able to be in contact either way. So that's the shilling for the channel. But as far as the commenting about the on-demand classes, do you want to give one more sort of plug for those, Kat, and where people can find all of those classes?
Yes, indeed, I do. In fact, I was kind of scrambling to pull up the right
Oh,
link.
sorry. I can stretch it a little more.
No, so I do both live classes, which are basically, they're usually on the weekends. They're usually Saturday or Sunday mornings. The ones that are coming up are the Fran Wild class and the replenishing class and the story class. There's also on-demand classes that you can take at your own pace. And I gave the link for that. But if you want the overall list for the school, there it is. There's a link. But the thing that's good about the school is that every live class has 3 scholarship slots in it for people who couldn't afford to take the class. So don't let price be prohibitive. The only thing that qualifies you for a scholarship is that basically you couldn't take the class otherwise and you think it would be useful to you. And there's details on the site about how to apply. And it makes me happy when people use those. I do have one still open for tomorrow's Fran Wild, not for Saturday's Fran Wild class, as well as ones for the Sunday class.
Yeah,
So.
that's really nice of Kat to do, and is again, it's demonstrative of the kind of person that she is, which we see in many different ways, which is a very generous person. Yeah, Fran Wild is great. Agreed, Parzival. So let's see. Any classes you have that you would recommend specifically for short stories? I tend to think more long form and find it easier to plot out novels, but want to write more short stories.
Well, I would definitely keep an eye on my classes because the focus is more story on the novels there. Fran Wild does some classes that I think are good. Oh gosh, what's her name? I have a resource list on my website that just says basically resources for fantasy and science fiction writers. If you look on there, there should be a number of other places that do classes. And SIFWA has a list as well, the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America.
I was going to
How important would I rate reading regularly? I would say 10.
Yep.
9 or 10.
Yep. 100%. For multiple reasons. Number one, because you need to know what the field is, what's going on in the field. You also need to know what's going on outside the field. You know, if you want to learn about pace, you could do worse than to read some good thrillers. If you want to know about how to represent kind of emotional sweep, reading a couple of good romance novels can fit that description too. If you want to be able to understand how to tie in history, nonfiction, particularly narrative nonfiction, can be helpful for that. But you need, and also I would also recommend drama because it really helps you with dialogue and character development. You've got to read. Everyone that we've talked about, that Kat's talked about today, all of those people succeeded because they knew the rules and then how they could break them in particular ways. The James Joyce example, James Joyce's Ulysses only works because he wrote Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is a very good but conventional autobiography. He writes that first. And it's because he knows how to do stuff like that and then breaks the rules with Ulysses and then breaks them even further with Finnegan's Wake. And who the hell knows, exactly what's going on in that book. Even to this day, we don't all fully know. But he can do that because he knows the rules first, and you do that through learning to read. Not to mention the fact, hopefully you enjoy reading, because otherwise you might be in the wrong job if you're writing and you don't actually like reading that much. But yeah, hugely, hugely important to read and read widely, I think. So read or listen to at least 3 books a week. Good man. That's what I'm talking about. That is good stuff. Read a lot and write a lot. Yes, but read and write intentionally, Parzival. Yeah. Read and write intentionally. That's why Kat's classes here are so valuable, because it allows you to focus in on some of the things she pointed out. And I'd encourage all of you, take some of what you learned from Kat today, and in the process of reading over the course of the next few weeks, see how those things play out. I mean, I was taking notes in the retweet, so I'm just like, I would think about that as I read other books, because it's really valuable to be able to get Kat's insight and have that focus. Exactly, Rock God. Yep, same for photography or anything. Yeah. So this was great. Thank you again, as always, Kat. It was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And they can find all of this again at kittywampus.net, I believe. And you will see, of course, Kat tomorrow as Petra Sinis with a large hammer and with a whole bunch of stuff going down, in that campaign, and like Carlos and his dad and a whole bunch of things.
And if anyone's at Dragon Con, I'm going to be at Dragon Con So come by the dealer's room, the Bard's Tower in the dealer's room.
Ooh, very nice. That's right. Yeah, in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
The week after this one.
Oh,
Yes,
I
Tolkien
have
and
so
Shakespeare.
many of them. I'm recently reading a lot of Ursula Le Guin,
Oh,
and I
she's so
will
great.
say she's a good one.
Oh, man.
But
Yeah,
there's a bunch of them.
she's tremendous. But yeah, Shakespeare and Tolkien are my two. I cannot decide between them. But there's so many incredible, great ones. Yeah, for sure. Kat, thank you so much. This was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
And we will see you tomorrow. Chat, can we get some love for Kat and this wonderful class? And of course, she'll be back with another class next month for Rambo Academy. But definitely subscribe to her stuff over there and make sure you take some of these classes because there's even more of it as well. Kat, thank you. I will see you tomorrow evening.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Okay. Good stuff, folks. Yeah, I love these. I really loved it. Again, it's just I get to geek out about, a really, really fine writer who's really thought about this stuff. And, I know that it's not always the case that people it's not always the case that knowing how to do something well means that you can teach it well, right? I mean, that's its own skill. So I know some writers who are very gifted teachers, and I know other writers who just not the right. It's not their bag, baby. And that's fine, But it's really, for me, great when I can actually see someone who's really, really good at teaching it and also at writing it and being able to see that. And you will see more of that from Kat, of course, as the stuff from Tor comes out and as other things that she's got going on comes out. You will get a chance to see even more of that as time goes on. So, but I hope you had a chance to enjoy it. And I'm glad you enjoyed. Yes, I hope that was helpful as far as Twitch is concerned. Twitch is a big place. And there are a lot of channels that do some things like we do, and then there's some channels that don't. And that's cool, like it's a big world. But I hope that you will take what you've learned here and be able to apply it elsewhere and, stop back with us because we do a lot of story and narrative focused thing on this channel. I do a fair bit of, I do sometimes Arvanaut Idol, which is a creative writing contest that we do maybe about once a year, something like that. I will also do sometimes readings of my work or other people's works. We've got other stuff like that may be coming on down the pike. And obviously I talk about my own projects, and we have a chance to do things like Kat's wonderful class that you just saw. So hopefully folks will be able to come back here for this. And hopefully you'll be able to spread the word about the channel because that always is a big help to us here. We will be back to you fine folks tomorrow evening. Again, I believe it is at 8 p.m. Eastern. I have to double check if it's 8 or 8:30, but we will be back tomorrow with some awesome Esper Genesis, the sponsored space opera. The Alligator Alley folks are the same people who did my Tales and Tomes from the Forbidden Library, to which Kat Rambo contributed a piece. And by the way, one of her, in fact, you know what? I don't know if Kat is still on, but this was the little brochure that they produced for Gen Con. This book will be out in a few weeks. So let me just read this, okay? This is an example of exactly what Kat was just talking about from Kat. This is called The Book of the Balance. It is one of the books that you can find within the Forbidden Library, and we had many authors who contributed one of these. This appears to be a regular accounting ledger stamped with the name and seal of Biddlescent and Daughters Bank, Branch 3. A successful DC-10 wisdom check will allow a player reading it to notice that the first name on the first page is the person the book is closest to, usually that reader, and that the balance number represents their total net worth in the world down to the last copper piece. There are no markings or other indications to show why this particular ledger is magical or who created the object, and inquiries about the bank will be unable to find anyone who has ever heard of it. This book can be used indefinitely until the spell magic is cast on it or the person the book is closest to. When this happens, that person will be unable to read numbers for a period of 1d3 days. Now, obviously, this is just a description of something. It's not the dynamic, everything we describe, all the aspects of something. But I think it's really an example of what she's talking about, specific concrete details, things like Biddle Cent and Daughters, which sounds exactly like what you would expect from a bank like this. The balance number representing the total net worth of the character down to the last copper piece. All of that stuff is really lovely, and that's an example of exactly what Kat was talking about tonight. So you will see more of that from Tales and Tomes of the Forbidden Library. That's going to be out in about 3 to 4 weeks. If you type in exclamation point library, you can still pre-order it, by the way. And that is going to be coming out soon. The people who did that Alligator Alley are the same people who do Esper Genesis, which is coming out tomorrow. And by the way, the Threats Database, which is basically the monster manual for Esper Genesis, has just come out in PDF form for Kickstarter backers, and I have it in my hot little hands. So that means that my players will have many monsters. Will not ever encounter any of those threats in an adventure. I mean, why would that? I can't imagine why that would happen ever. But anyway, great pleasure to be with all of you tonight. I hope you enjoyed what you saw and heard. Again, please make sure to follow the channel if you liked it. Please check out the YouTube at !ArvTube, the Discord with !ArvCord. I know, I love that, right, Coven? !ArvCord. Please check out as well the Twitter, !ArvTweets for that, to follow me over there. You can find out about all of this at arvaneleron.com, my website. Also check out, by the way, speculatesf.com if you want to see more authors doing game stuff, because speculatesf.com has a number of things already. Some of you may have heard that they have announced a new Eberron source book. Freaking love Eberron. And I happen to have run several sessions of an Eberron game with such notables as Marie Bilodeau from Emberwind fame on this channel, Maurice Broaddus, whose career is really blowing up, really, really good guy, Maurice. People like Lauren Roy, who have got a bunch of awesome stuff happening, and of course my good friend and co-host of Speculate, Mike Underwood. So if you want a chance to hear more of that, you can check us out over there at speculatesf.com. On the financial side of things, checking out the merchandise area here really helps. !Arv Shop, where you can get merchandise relating to one of several campaigns that I run on this channel. !Arv Treon is that Patreon down there, which really helps financially and otherwise with the channel. It really is kind of the backbone of the channel, and you can get cool stuff for yourself as well. Forbidden Library with viewers, well, I mean, I've got a couple of Kickstarter goals actually require me I'm going to be running a session for people of Forbidden Library at some point. As a Kickstarter fulfillment, so you will expect to see some of that. Maybe down the line, I could see that happening. And then, last but certainly not least, the sub button right above that video window, which Rock God was kind enough to use in his resub today. You can get those custom sub badges. You can that allows you to, for example, ask questions during the Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers class, and you can get emotes to use on the channel and things like that. So you can even get inspiration to help the players in one of my D&D campaigns. So that's what you can do if you deal with that. Otherwise, though, I'm going to see you lovely folks tomorrow. No raid today, I think, because we're sort of in between days. Normally, we don't stream on Thursdays, although it's starting to happen more than it used to because of Emberwind and Kat's class here. But no raid for today. We will, of course, be back tomorrow, and that's going to be awesome. So make sure to stop by at about 8 p.m. Eastern, as I say. Make sure to follow all the things and support us, and that will make a big difference to the channel. Thank you to my wonderful viewers. Thank you to my mods. Of course, JRab, always a pleasure. Thank you to also my wonderful subscribers, JRab, Nonstop, Nordwolf, Brahms, Coven Guy, and Rock God. Thank you so much for all of that. Thank you again to Kat Rambo for the wonderful class. Thank you so much, Kat. Really, really helpful, and I really appreciate it. You'll be streaming after yours is over. Then you guys know where you should go. Then you should go to Coven. You should go to Coven Guy. As soon as we're done with this, then you should definitely check that out. Thank you to Claptrap's Junk Drawer. What an awesome name. I hope you like what you saw and heard. Claptrap and will support the channel in the many ways I've described. Thank you to Commander Root. Thank you to Don Stolioni. Good name as well. Thank you to EKEG. Thank you to Eric Olson. Thank you to Gorgar. Thank you to Host Merlife. Host me, Raffle, I beg your pardon. Thank you to Lurks. Thank you to Margarita Noir, sorry, and I hope you enjoyed your introduction to Twitch, Margarita. Thank you to Jagtris. What's up? Hello, Jagtris. Yeah, sorry, we're just closing up. We just had a wonderful class with Kat Rambo, but you can check out the VOD and so on. And good to see you, Jagtris. Hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you to Marshoot XO, Mito Isoko. Thank you to Miley Gibb 19. Thank you to Mubat, to Parzival. A lot of new people here, I think some from Kat's Patreon. If you liked what you saw, saw here. Again, please follow and support us over here. We like to think we do a lot of story and narrative-based things with writing that relate to games, but also just to regular fiction as well. So thank you for being a part of it tonight. Thank you to Second Obs. Thank you to Psychos. Thank you to you, Christensen, V&K, Virgo Praz, Windsock, and Zetsebs. Always a pleasure to have everyone here. Thank you all so much. And I will see all of you lovely people tomorrow for Esper Genesis. Until then, everyone be good to each other. Thanks again to Kat, and I'll see all of you wonderful people very soon. Be good to each other. Have a good night.
What do you remember when the world was fresh and new? When it all seemed clear to you? When your aim was straight and true? Were your mind untroubled by the questions in the dark? Content to play your part, open pathways to your heart? Were your life untainted by a host of broken dreams? When all your acts were queens, understood all that it means?